And today I'm going to share with you everything that you need to know about writing task one. So if you've been struggling with this, you're in the right place today, because I'm going to share you 3 simple steps to take when it comes to writing task one. So we'll get started right away with writing task one. Just to give you an overview of task number one in the academic writing section, this is where you're asked to write 150 words, and you will want to allot 20 minutes to do this task. And all your task is to do, if you want to achieve the task that's required, you're asked to summarize and report and compare data on a graph, a chart, or a diagram. And task one fits into the whole writing section. Writing task two is where you give an opinion essay and you take 40 minutes to write that essay. And I always recommend that on test day that you do task two before you do task one, because task two is a priority and you get more marks in the writing section for accomplishing task two. But today we're focusing on task one, and after you've completed task two on test day, you'll want to take your final 20 minutes of the test and complete this task. And it's just important to realize that it's not at all like task number two. In task number one, you're only summarizing. You're only reporting on the data and comparing it. You are not asked to give any reasons for why the data on the graph or diagram. You're not asked to give your opinion, and you're not asked to really analyze it in any way. You are simply describing what you see and reporting on that. So your task really is, in your essay, your task is really to do 3 things. And the first thing you want to do is take a good look at the instructions and what you're asked to do. So you want, the first thing you're given in the instructions is a brief description of the graphic, whether it's a diagram or a chart or a graph. And as you can see here, it just says the chart below shows the number of men and women in further education in Britain in 3 periods and whether they were studying full-time or part-time. And then it gives you the instructions. And if you've seen any of my other previous videos, and you know that I always mention this, it's one of the most important things in the IELTS exam. Always read the instructions. And you can see that you're only asked to summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. So you only have 3 tasks, 3 things that you have to accomplish in this essay. The first is summarize, and then select and report on the main features, and then make some kind of comparison where it's relevant. Okay, so these are your 3 tasks. Select the main features, write about the main features, and compare the main features. Nothing more and nothing less. And again, no opinions. You don't have to give any reasons for what you see or analyze it in any way. Okay, so let's get started. The first thing that you're going to want to do before you start writing is to plan what you're going to write. And this should only take about 3 or 4 minutes. And it's good to take the time to plan, because Even if you take 4 or 5 minutes to plan, you will write a much better essay in 15 minutes than you would in 20 minutes if you don't plan what you're going to write. So the first step you're going to want to do is just remember you are given some extra paper to make notes on, and you're going to take your extra note paper and you're just going to jot down an outline and some ideas for what you're going to write before you start writing. So as you begin to make notes, there are certain things that you're going to want to make note of. The first thing are the two axes of the graph. Now, I'll just go back for a moment. You can see that the graph has the x-axis and the y-axis. And I've taken the x-axis and turned it on its side just so that we can see what it says. So the first of the main features that I want to make sure that I'm aware of is that this graph is about men and women in further education. And when I look at the axes, the other thing that I just want to take note of is I want to make sure that I notice the units of measurement. So in this case, it's men and women in further education, and it's measured in units of thousands, 200,000, 400,000, 600,000. So I just want to be aware of that as I'm beginning to plan my essay. And then on the y-axis, the bottom of the graph, I can see that it's divided according to years, 1970, 71, 1980, and 1990, so that it's measured in 10-year increments or measured in decades. So that's just the first thing that I want to notice. Then I'm going to also look at some other labels and some other labels that are on the diagram. So in this case, I want to be clear to see that, okay, this graph is divided into two sections, one for the men and one for the women, male and female. And I also want to notice that the gray bars represent part-time education, and the black bars represent full-time education, so that I'm just becoming quickly aware of what the graph is about by looking at the labels. And these labels are what I'm going to use in my writing, in my descriptions, and in my reporting. And then I want to make sure that I notice any similarities or differences, because I'm asked to make comparisons. So it's clear, one of the things that's obvious here, that there's a lot more students, both male and female, that are in part-time education compared to full-time education. The numbers represented by the black bars, which is full-time education, are much smaller than the ones that represent the part-time education. The other thing I want to notice, and I just mentioned a minute ago about trends, what I want to notice is when I look at the male section of the graph, I notice that it starts higher, goes lower, and gets higher again. Another way of saying this is that the levels fluctuate, okay? They go up and down. But when I look at the female section of the graph, I notice that they only increase, okay? They don't fluctuate, they increase. So they start lower, and they each decade from 1970, 1980, and 1990, they get higher. So what I'm doing as I look at these things is I'm just getting an overview and an idea of what the graph is showing. So then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to jot down a few notes to help me organize my essay. Okay. Okay, so this is just what I've noticed, as I just mentioned. There was an overall increase when it comes, if I look at, for example, if I look at the full-time education, which is the black bars, in both cases, male and female, there was an overall increase for both. So that's a pattern that I'll want, or a trend that I'll want to make sure I keep track of. Men fluctuated and women only increased. Okay, so I'm going to jot those three things down on my notes. And then I'm going to look for some other things that I might put in my essay. So for example, if I wanted to make a comparison, I could say that in 1970, if I'm just looking at the full-time, that's what the FT stands for, the full-time education, the women, the female section, they were about half the amount of the male section. So if I want to make an easy comparison, I could say that in 1970, I know I'm going to write that the number of women enrolled in full-time education was half of that of men. But in 1990, if we look at the graph, women became equal with men in terms of the number enrolled in full-time education. So I'm just making some observations and I'm making notes. And now I kind of have a good idea of what I'm going to write in my essay, because I remember I have to write those three things. What's my overall summary? And I could say that in full-time education, there was an overall increase. But when it came to part-time education over the 3 years, the level of men fluctuated and the women only increased. And I'm going to include some details about that. And then the comparison that I've chosen to make is that I'm going to talk about how in 1970, when it started, only half the amount of women were enrolled in full-time education as men. Now, I don't have to. This is something very important, and you'll see this as we go along, and that is, you don't have to report on every detail, and you don't have to report on every comparison. You want to choose some specific ones and only report on those. You cannot possibly cover everything. And I'll tell you why. And that's because of the number of words that you have to write. You want to write a minimum of 150 words. And when it comes to writing task 1, that's actually not going to be a problem at all. As a matter of fact, you will find it quite easy to write 150 words. The problem is making sure that you don't write too many words. Now, if you're asked to write a minimum of 150, and that won't be a problem, the only thing you'll want to be careful of is that you don't write more than 200 to 225. You don't want to write an essay that's too long, because then you will start writing and using extra phrases and extra vocabulary that you probably don't need. And then what happens is you're in more danger of writing writing improper grammar or improper vocabulary and using words and sentence structures that maybe you're not really that familiar with and not really that strong in. So I really want to encourage you to keep it simple and limit yourself to the three things that you're asked to do: summarize, report on main features, and compare. But only choose one important thing from each of those areas. Okay? Don't try to cover everything. You'll end up writing twice as much as you need to. And if you end up writing 300 words, that's a little too much for writing task one. And writing more is not always better. It will not help your score to write too much. Okay. If you have any questions, just place them in the comments if you're watching on replay or as we're going along. Okay. The first thing, once we know what we're going to, the three things that we're going to write on, we're going to write our introduction. Because what's going to happen is those three things, summarizing, reporting, and comparing, are going to make up 3 paragraphs in our essay. But before we write those 3 paragraphs, we just want to write a very brief introduction. And writing the introduction is actually a very simple process. So what you do is you take the description from the instructions for your essay, and all you do is put it into your own words. You rephrase it. It doesn't even have to be a full paragraph. It's likely only going to be one sentence. So if we remember from what we saw when we first looked at the instructions for the graph that we're looking at, it says the chart below shows the number of men and women in further education in Britain in 3 periods and whether they were studying full-time or part-time. So I simply just want to take that and put it in my own words, and it might look something like this. The bar graph illustrates how many male and female students, so I just took men and women and said male and female, were studying full-time and part-time in Britain during the years 1970, 71, 1980, 81, and 1990, 91. So instead of saying 3 periods, I actually mentioned the 3 periods. And this is all that I have to do to have a good introductory sentence. It doesn't even have to be a full paragraph. This is the introduction, and basically I'm saying what the graph is about very generally. Okay, so this is my introduction. And now I'm ready to write my 3 paragraphs. And because I planned ahead of time, I know exactly what I'm going to write in those 3 paragraphs. Okay, so let's take a look at paragraph number 1. So paragraph number 1, I'm just going to give my overview. Remember, I'm going to do an overview, a summary and overview. I'm going to give a report on some of the main features in my 2nd paragraph, and then in my 3rd paragraph, I'm going to make a comparison. So here's my overview of the main features. And I'm going to just say something like, overall, the number of students in full-time education increased over this time. Now, with regard to the part-time education, there was a steady increase in women choosing to study part-time, but for men, the level fluctuated. And if I just go back a couple of slides, just to remind you, when I first made my plan out in my rough notes, I said overall increase, men fluctuated, and women increased. And that's all I've written It's a very short paragraph, only two sentences. So the idea, again, don't write more than you have to. Just give a simple explanation and an overall summary of the main features. Okay, let's go to paragraph number 2. So in paragraph number 2, I'm going to give details of the first main feature that I've decided to talk about. So first of all, I'm going to mention that when it came to men studying full-time, it grew steadily. And I'm going to say, remember on the x-axis, I had my units of measurement in thousands. So I'm just going to take that simple information and I'm going to talk about that as a main feature. I'm going to talk about what the x-axis and the bars show. Between the academic periods 1971 and 1991, the figures for men studying full-time grew in steady increments, beginning at 100,000 in 1970-71 and rising to nearly 300,000 in 1990 and 1991. And then I'm going to talk about the same things for the women. For the women, the numbers had also risen to around 300 on an increasing trend. Remember, we noticed that the women only increased. Notably, however, the figure for females in full-time education was roughly half of that of men, showing a greater take-up than men between 1970 and 1980-81. So in other words, the amount of women grew more quickly. It was a greater take-up than that of men. So I hope that you're seeing how this works. It's not difficult. I've just chosen to describe the trend with men and then the trend with women. Okay, that's the only feature that I've decided to include in this paragraph. Remember, whether you're writing in task 2 or task 1, when you come to writing paragraphs, a paragraph only has one topic. It only has one topic. That's the purpose of a paragraph, to describe one topic or one main point. Okay? So what we're talking about here, the topic of this paragraph is full-time studies. We're only choosing to talk about full-time education, and we're talking about the difference in what happened with men and what happened with women. Okay, we're not talking about part-time education, even though that's on the graph. We've decided that we're going to choose to write about full-time. You don't have to cover every detail of the graph. You're choosing a main feature and discussing and reporting on that. Again, you cannot possibly fit every detail in just over 150 words. If you try to do too much, you'll write too much, and that will not get you any extra points. Okay? And then there's a little mistake on the slide here. This should say, this should say paragraph 3. It's actually the second paragraph of the summary and reporting. Now I'm going to talk about part-time education. Okay, the first paragraph was about the full-time education. This paragraph is about the part-time education. Okay, and yeah, I'm going to just mention that it was a different pattern. For women, there was a steady increase in the part-time study, and I mentioned the numbers, 750 to 1 million And then I say, on the other hand, for men in part-time studies, it fluctuated. And I mentioned from 1 million to 1971, it dropped by 200,000 to 1980, and then recovered and increased, okay? But over the whole time period, okay, the trend between men and women in part-time education reversed, male students being greater in number in 1970, and female students taking pole position by 1991, which means the pole position means the highest and fastest growing position. Okay, so remember, in one paragraph I talked about full-time studies, and in the second paragraph I talked about the part-time studies. But I didn't talk about both in the same paragraph, okay? And then if I look at my whole essay, it's a total of 4 paragraphs, okay? And it's I've reached my limit. I've covered my limit, my minimum of 150 words. And actually, if you were to count the words in this essay, you would find that it's actually about a total of just over 200 words. So you can see the problem is not going to be reaching 150 words. The actual problem in task number 1 is writing too much. You don't want to get up into the 250 to 300 word range. You want to keep it as close to not going over 200 as you can. Remember, extra words could mean words that are unnecessary. Extra sentences could mean sentences that are unnecessary. You do want to keep it simple. Only write 3 things and only have one topic, one main feature that you're talking about for each paragraph. And when you're talking about those main features, you also mention a comparison for each one. It's a simple matter of only 3 things: a summary, reporting on the main features, and making a comparison. So I hope that you found this helpful. That's really all there is to writing task 1. And with some practice, you'll find that you'll become quite good at it. Just remember to plan what you're going to say before you write. Take a look at the main details, the labels, the axes, and just report on the main features and make comparisons between the main features when necessary.